Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time of the day that you're joining us. We're very excited to host this webinar today, and we want to welcome you on behalf of the Gender-Based Violence Area of Responsibilities Community of Practice. My name is Sarah Martin. I'm the COP, as we call it, the Community of Practice's moderator, co-moderator, alongside with Beth Phan. And one of the things that we do, for those of you who are not familiar with the GBV AOR Community of Practice, is that we bring in different specialists of gender-based violence and emergency specialists to present and to educate us on new tools and new things that have been developed in order to build our capacity as gender-based violence and emergency specialists. So with that, I'm very excited to welcome Micah Williams, the Senior Global GBV Advisor for International Medical Corps. Micah is calling in today from the United States, and she is going to be presenting the new toolkit that has been developed by IMC. It's a toolkit focused on community leaders, and it's called Traditions and Opportunities. And we're going to be learning today more about how we can engage community leaders in order to prevent, respond, and mitigate gender-based violence. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Micah.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Well, I'm really happy to have this opportunity and grateful for those who are joining. Yes, so we'll dive into this just to say briefly that I work with International Medical Corps, and we're very happy to roll out this new resource. Hope that it might be useful to the community. And I just want to give an overview of kind of what's inside the resource and how to access it, and then make some time for questions and discussion. So yes, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. The title of the resource is Traditions and Opportunities, and we'll take a look at what it includes. This is the two pieces of the toolkit. The first is a booklet, which is online, but it's one resource that combines guidance, tools, and different resources related to different areas of work, GBV. And then there's an accompanying manual that is only training resources. And we'll get into the details of both of these through our discussion. But first, I want to give some background on why International Medical Corps developed this resource, and our reflections that led us to see a need for something like this. And I'll be interested in the discussion to see if you, in your different areas of work and with your different organizations, have some of the same experiences. So within our technical team and across our programs, we saw a need for maybe more guidance, more specific tools and resources for working with these people who we call leaders. So as a team, we sort of reflected on some of our experience thus far and found that first, even when we talk about leaders, we weren't necessarily talking about the same people. That across the settings where we work, and for us this is humanitarian settings because we focus our GBV programs on emergency settings. So the community leaders in those areas, or the leaders in those areas, very often the GBV programs talk about traditional leaders, but then in some other settings the leaders were formal authority figures within, like, maybe provincial or city government. And sometimes they didn't have formal authority at all, that they would be informal, but still quite influential people within the community. And then that they had different roles related to GBV. So I think depending on where you work, that might make sense, but that leaders can be very influential, and that if people are looking to them and that they guide any behavior in the community, then that's certainly something that's important to us as GBV programs. But also that in some cases, leaders are taking direct decisions on GBV cases, or at least like family matters, community matters that might include issues of GBV. And in some cases, they're leading courts or decision-making processes that would adjudicate crimes. So all of this, like, when we were looking in Europe and the Middle East and Africa, we're talking about maybe different roles, but still important. And that across very diverse settings, all of our GBV programs required some kind of involvement of community leaders. And that was at least sort of the buy-in or working with leaders as gatekeepers to just get a program off the ground. But then in some cases, programs were quite involved with leaders. Usually that was focused on like awareness raising activities or training. We also found that some of our programs really valued their work with leaders or saw a need to do more, when other programs were pretty reserved about engaging leaders at all because they worried that the role in the community was harmful toward women and girls, or that somehow engaging with the leaders at all would reinforce or sort of validate practices that they didn't feel were survivor-centered. And then overall, we did feel that there was a gap in terms of resources and guidance and recorded good practice with both the what and the how to engage leaders. So with those reflections, we had some questions about, well, what could we provide? And these are questions that we took to the donor of this project, which is the United States government, BHA, who's been a very supportive and patient donor through the process of developing this toolkit. So we sort of challenged ourselves to think, well, how are we really engaging leaders? Is it only limited to the sort of gatekeeping and then maybe a 16 days of activism event or a training, like a kind of one-off, or are some of our programs more meaningfully engaging leaders, and what does that look like? And what other potential is there? So in some cases, we knew that our programs were actually directly engaging leaders to advocate on behalf of survivors in certain cases. But were we doing work with leaders just in sort of the day-to-day business of GBV programming, like setting up referral systems? Were we looking to leaders' responsibilities related to risk mitigation? So thinking about the full breadth of work that could contribute to addressing GBV. And then those questions around how to navigate the very valid reservations that some teams have, that most of the leadership structures in most places where we work are very male dominated. So how do teams engage with those structures and recognize the very real influence that leaders have without inadvertently reinforcing that influence in a way that could be harmful? And is it validating to sort of look at the processes of mediation or dispute resolution at all, instead of just sort of keeping a distance? So how do we work with those while also representing women and girls and making sure that our programming is accountable to women and girls? And then, of course, within all of this, how do we, instead of, or I guess, while working with male leaders, how do we in all of our actions help to promote the role of the women leaders who are within communities, even if those aren't formal leaders? How do we promote and elevate the role that women are playing in all of the communities where we work? A few more questions. So then the questions about how we sort of capture what we're doing, how we learn from what we're already doing. And by we, I don't just mean IMC's programs, but also the larger community of practitioners that are in this meeting today and around the world, that we know there's so much being done and a lot of creative work with leaders. So how could we document that and make it useful to other teams who are engaged in the same kind of work or problem solving, but also how to make that, how to sort of balance the risks of, we don't want to just give people the principles and the sort of considerations. We want it to be practical, and we want to give people some real solid advice or sort of do this, don't do that, the how-to that we know is really important to our teams. And yet, whenever you get into those questions of telling someone how to do something, then there are all of the cultural considerations, the contextual considerations, and the safety and ethics issues. So that balance of making sure that something could be broadly applicable, but also practical. And then linked to that, I would say also this idea of we want something to be rooted in our standards and principles, but we also don't just want to stop there. We feel that we had already enough guidance for our programmings in the principles that should guide their work, and we really wanted to give them something more practical. And we also wanted to honor the idea that we don't already know everything that should be done, that there's a lot of creativity in programming, and that we didn't want to just point people to the sort of approaches that are so well documented and tested, but to recognize that yes, there are additional things we can and do with our programs that are not harmful, that that creativity eventually becomes the new resources and the new ways of working. So I hope some of that makes sense. I don't know if there are questions yet, Sarah, that I should address before moving on. I can't see the chat.
There's one question, but I think it'll become more clear as you go on, and we'll save it till a bit later.
Okay, great. Okay, so I mentioned that BHA was the donor of this project, and it was a very lengthy process to develop the toolkit, which with a lot of challenges over the last few years, but I've put here the process to share how we tried to come up with what ultimately is this toolkit. And that started with consultations with a lot of people who may be on the call today, with specialists across agencies, across settings, both within and outside of INC for sure. We also had a plan of collecting, and we definitely put out calls to try to collect unpublished tools from different organizations, thinking that, in different field sites, practitioners might be developing training guides or sort of how-tos or tip sheets on how to work with leaders. We ultimately didn't receive much of that. We didn't find much of that, but we did a really lengthy desk review of available resources for GBV programming, but also looked outside of the GBV sector at like sexual reproductive health and other sort of related areas of work where engaging community leaders might be important, to see what lessons we could draw from other fields of work, including development setting, not just emergencies. And then we selected 3 of our own country programs to pilot this work. And those contexts were Iraq, Cameroon, and Mali. And specifically, they were emergency settings within all 3 of those countries and settings of displacement. And we did lengthy assessments in each of those environments. So the assessments included talking with the GBV programs, the IMC GBV programs, but also other GBV actors in the coordination structures, government. We also talked with both women and men and adolescent girls in the communities. And we talked with leaders themselves. And then as we were piloting, developing the toolkit, we did country level consultations in each of those 3 countries and coordination through the subclusters and through government agencies. We developed the draft toolkit and translated it into a couple of languages and then piloted it. After the pilot, we did a lot of revision. So there was an external review as well in the pilot countries. And then we went back to the drawing board, to be honest, with a lot of the resource. And we hired multiple specialists to contribute to developing what is the final toolkit. That also involved another round of consultations and then interviews with practitioners to capture some sort of field practice that we could integrate throughout the toolkit. And then finally, we did a global external review through the GBV AOR. And we translated and designed and now published, finally, at the end of last year, this resource that we're now sharing. So just briefly, I'll share a bit about the assessment in case it's of interest. Over on the left side, you see the areas of kind of inquiry, what we were looking at with the assessment. We wanted to capture the program experience as well as the perception of leaders among community, the leaders' attitudes, the leaders' knowledge and feelings about GBV programming, how involved they were in GBV response, like what kinds of actions they were taking, as well as their involvement in risk mitigation and prevention activities. And then, of course, looking at who are the women leaders and what are the opportunities for women's leadership. And so our findings mostly affirmed the sort of reflections that we came to this project with at the very beginning, which are that across the board, people found that leaders were important, that they were carrying important responsibilities within the community, that they were very influential. There was variance across communities about the perception of leaders in terms of how they serve women and girls. We found some real reservations among adolescent girls in all three countries about how leaders represent their interests. So that was an interesting finding for us. And then a lot of the leaders did have, and these were leaders who were to some extent engaged by GBV programs, both IMC and other organizations. So they did have some knowledge about GBV concepts, GBV programming, but nevertheless, we did find that many leaders expressed very concerning attitudes and beliefs related to GBV, including very harmful ideas in some cases about how a survivor should be treated, which would include like marrying girls to perpetrators of rape, even promoting ideas that in some cases a survivor should be killed. So some very harmful ideas expressed, but there was quite a bit of variation. And then we found in all three of these contexts, they're quite conservative contexts, and the role of formal leadership with women was limited. But we were encouraged to see that there were very specific and real opportunities in each context to promote women's leadership or to strengthen what already existed, which in some cases were women serving as informal leaders in certain capacities. In other cases, they were integrated into leadership structures, but didn't have the same kind of decision-making authority. So I think I'll move on without going deeper into assessment. I want to get to what we actually then produced, which is this resource I want to introduce. So first is to define the audience for the toolkit. I try not to say the targets because that's something I'm trying to work out of my vocabulary with programming. But this resource is meant to serve GBV programs, GBV teams, and we define that as a set of GBV practitioners within one organization or multiple organizations that were supporting a common program. We very intentionally wanted to be sure we were inclusive of different kinds of organizations so that this resource should serve GBV programs within organizations like mine, which is an international NGO, but also national organizations, local organizations, with an appreciation that the resources would be different in different types of organizations. And of course, across different contexts, we're looking at very like high resource programming versus low resource programming. So that was something that was important to us. It is very much for GBV programs. So this resource is not, it's not something for GBV mainstreaming. It's not something that might be useful across all sectors. We really want it to be used by teams that have some foundational understanding of GBV and that are doing work related to GBV prevention and response already. So this is meant to supplement that work. And then community leaders. This is something that we really found we needed to unpack because, as I mentioned at the start of the call, a lot of our teams talk about traditional leaders. And you'll see a nod to that in the title of this resource with traditions and opportunities. But we didn't want to exclusively focus on traditional leaders for a number of reasons. First, not all contexts include an idea of traditional or religious leaders. In some contexts, those would be just authority figures within like maybe regional or community level government. We also recognize that would exclude opportunities in some cases for women to be seen as leaders, when in fact women are de facto leaders in every community, because at least in the roles of influential people and very often health workers, teachers, aunties, that we want to make sure that we ourselves adopt a vision of leadership that is not limited to structures that are rooted in traditions. Also recognizing that concepts of leadership change all the time, and they change during emergencies. So one of the things that we found, even with our initial reflections, is that leaders are not only very important and influential in the settings where we work, but they often become so much more important during emergencies. And that's because the formal systems might break down, services might be harder to access, and they can take on even more important roles or a wider range of roles. And the same is true for women. So then the third audience here, and there's an overlap here, and I want to be clear about this. In all of the guidance related to engaging community leaders, we do want to be sure that that's speaking to both women and men leaders, as well as adolescent leaders, but that we also draw out special attention to women leaders, because we saw a need to devote additional attention and support to empowering women leaders. I'm sorry for my voice, I'm still recovering from COVID. So returning again to the two pieces of this toolkit, we have the guidance and the resources, as well as the training manual. So an overview of the resource. The idea is that this would provide the practitioners, the GBV programs, their teams, with new ideas. So sometimes we know that we're just sort of stuck in what we're doing, and we want to know what others might have tried, or what else beyond the awareness raising or beyond the training can we do. So we wanted to give sort of just a range of ideas. This might work, this might not work, but these are some of the ideas of ways that you can engage leaders. And then guidance for how to do that, how to, the sort of the approach of engaging leaders, which includes communication skills and a framework, and how you communicate sort of respect, how you effectively engage anyone, particularly people of influence. And then tools to do all of that. Throughout, we have concepts, core concepts woven throughout each section of the guidance to look at how teams can adapt all of this and consider the safety and ethics and contextual realities to make sure that the resources are appropriate for their settings. But it is intended for humanitarian settings. And then also, just to be clear, that this is really like, I don't know the right way, but it's sort of like a menu of options. And it's meant for programs to pick pieces of this that make sense to their programs and then to apply it in their work. So it does not outline a new or specific program to follow. So there are other resources for that. And this guidance, I'll go through some of the different sections, but we very intentionally direct teams to some of those existing resources and approaches, things like SASA or EMAP that people might be familiar with, that we weren't trying to duplicate or replace anything, any evidence-based approaches to longer term like programming interventions, that this is really meant to complement and to look at not just sort of one approach for working with leaders toward behavior change or social norms change, but looking at from the how do you introduce a program, how do you get that buy-in, through to how do you do direct advocacy when a leader is involved with a case. So trying to provide some guidance across a range of different areas where a GBV program might have need or interest to engage a leader. So I'm going to link here. I hope this works. I'm going to show you the website where you can find the resource. I don't know if I'll take a minute. Hopefully everyone can see this. So this is the, yeah, great. Okay. So this is the landing page from International Medical Corps website where you can find the full resource. And when you scroll down, you'll see that we have these two components that I've been talking about, the guidance, tools, and resources, and then the training manual. And then you have first the resources here. So you can link to the full resource in English, French, or Arabic. There's a brief summary here to let you know what that full resource is all about. Within this full resource, this guidance, you have all of the chapters from the beginning, which is the core concepts and building a foundation with your team, and then the key areas of engagement, which are GBV Response, Risk Mitigation, Transformative Change, and supporting women leaders, and then all of the tools related to each of those areas of work. So this is the full resource you can download, and then you have it as one PDF. And then because I mentioned that, this is really a menu of options depending on the type of program, you can scroll down, and then each of those chapters is also broken out into smaller pieces. So if it's more useful to you to focus in on, let's just start with building a foundation for working with the leaders. And I'll talk a little bit more about these different chapters soon, but I wanted to show you that each of these is then available in all 3 languages. And then linked to the side are the specific tools. So each of the chapters has accompanying tools. Each of those are available in all 3 languages. And then importantly, some of the tools here are available in Word, Microsoft Word, instead of PDF, which means that you can download them and complete the tool or adapt the tool on your computer and then print it and use it. So we thought that would be more practical for teams rather than having like the big PDF of everything. That way you can just make changes directly to tools in your settings. So as you scroll down, you'll see this sort of bank of tools attached to each area of work throughout. And then we'll get into the training materials, and the same is true there. But I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and review those contents a bit here. And then you can find yourself on the website. But looking first at the manual, I mentioned when we looked at the website that the manual includes those key areas. So the start of this manual includes an introduction and overview with some information on how to use the toolkit, defining the terms, all of that. And then we have a chapter on GBV core concepts and approaches. And for GBV practitioners, this won't be new. We define GBV, we define core principles, including like intersectional feminist approach. We reference the key resources that should guide our work, but we take all of this and really apply it to work with leaders. So thinking about the important approaches and principles in our work with leaders. So I do hope people don't just skip past that content, because that should really guide our work, whatever it is that we're doing with leaders. And then the second chapter that's important across any type of programming is the building a foundation for engagement. So that's looking at who our team is, who we are, and who the leaders are in our settings, and what our plan is for working with them. And then depending on that plan, then we have the key areas of engagement, which are the response, risk mitigation, transformative change, and that's the sort of social behavior change, systems change, and then the additional support to women leaders. So in each of these key areas of engagement, in each of those chapters, it's the same format, and each of those chapters includes key concepts for that particular area of work. So key concepts related to GBV response with leaders, approaches. So what are the major approaches that we think we need to apply when working with leaders in this area of work, or what are the options? Because maybe for some programs, one approach is going to be safe or the right way to work with leaders, and one won't be. And then under each of those approaches, what are some of the ideas? And that's where you have like your sort of menu of options to choose from. And then linked to the ideas for engagement, we have the tools and resources that you would apply. So I'm going to unpack then the chapters. So the building a foundation, this is, I mentioned, across any area of work, hopefully the sort of building blocks, what's important. And the building a foundation chapter takes programs, and there's a training section linked to this as well for GBV teams, because the idea is for GBV teams to work amongst themselves to sort of go through a process of really thinking through building a strategy for community leader engagement that's appropriate to the context, to their team capacity, to their time frame and budget, etc. But that starts with building a team, understanding who the leaders are, sort of mapping out and making sure that our areas of work are speaking to the right leaders, and then looking at the planning. So it's pretty straightforward, but I think that very intentional process will help. We found, just to share, and some of our experiences peppered throughout the guidance, but one of the interesting findings of piloting was that we did this in 3 countries where teams were already well established and engaging leaders. But what we found is that, they hadn't necessarily gone through this really thoughtful process of how they were doing that and who they were working with. And one of the things that we found, for example, in the far north of Cameroon, our program had been engaged with leaders for a number of years. And when they went through a process of really like sitting down and working through with the team and mapping the leaders, they found leaders who they hadn't been involved with at all, including leaders who were really strong advocates for change. And they were able to sort of go back to the drawing board and find new ways to work with new leaders very effectively. So that was exciting just to see, that this process, it's not just at the start of a new program, but that we can all kind of reflect on the ways that we're working and start fresh. So these are, then we have the tools. This is a bank of tools for that, the building a foundation work. And Sarah, I don't know, should I pause? I see that there are chats, but I can't see the actual.
Yeah, questions. There's a couple of questions, but it's primarily on learning about what factors enabled success in leader engagement, vulnerability criteria, research, etc. I think it might be better to continue on, and then you can address these at the end, because it might distract flow.
Okay, just let me know if anything comes up, like a question of clarification, then I should interrupt. Okay, so then I have here, if you link back to the website, I mentioned that each chapter is available on its own as well. So you can see this opens up the PDF just of this single chapter, which is building a foundation for engagement. And you can see how these 6 steps there identified, the tools and resources, and then go through the guidance step by step. See the definitions. So just to show you sort of how the layout works. Everything, we have all of the internal links throughout the documents, so you can hop around. And then we have throughout the guidance, these call out boxes with examples from practice. So these aren't necessarily, exactly the right way to do something in your setting, but hopefully helpful to see how other programs have engaged in problem solving or what their experiences have been. And we pulled those examples from practice from the pilot countries, but also other programs, other IMC programs, and some from consultations with external audiences as well. Okay, so we have another example from practice here. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. So that's the building a foundation chapter, and then getting into the key areas of engagement. This starts with GBV Response. We'll see at the top how we've defined GBV Response and how it relates to community leaders. And then you see the approaches. So GBV Response, of course, is, I mean, I don't want to say the most, because we found, you know, the tricky safety and ethical issues across all areas of work with community leaders, but certainly this is the one that was the most fraught when we talk with GBV teams about how they work with leaders, whether it's appropriate to work with leaders. There is a lot of very valid concern about what that would mean for survivors, and a lot of concern among people who do casework with survivors around how community leaders get involved with their cases. But we do know, of course, that in many settings, survivors will choose to engage community leaders, or community leaders get involved with cases even when survivors don't want their involvement. In some cases, they play a very active role in mediating disputes between partners, or even trying to resolve situations that relate to community perpetrated GBV, to sexual violence. They can be involved with early forced marriage and other forms of GBV. And that could be both, you know, they can be implicated in abuse, but they can also be involved in trying to address incidents, either in ways that we as GBV actors think are helpful, or perhaps that are harmful and not contributing from a survivor-centered perspective. So unpacking GBV Response was really important for us, because there is, of course, the direct leader involvement in cases, but there's also a lot of other work related to GBV Response. And we had to challenge ourselves, like, are we only talking about mediation or traditional courts or engagement of cases? What about everything we do to set up response services? So what about the referral pathways? What about just strengthening access to services and addressing barriers to services? What about the response that survivors receive from their family and community? Because community leaders also influence those attitudes. So we broke this down basically into two major approaches, which is the strengthening the response systems. And we found like a lot of encouraging work and potential there, even in settings where leaders were not on board with a lot of other work, that there's still opportunity there to work with leaders. And then the other approach relates to fostering more survivor-centered attitudes, and that would be among the community and also with leaders themselves and their response to survivors. So you see those approaches again. I mentioned across each chapter, we have the key concepts for that area of work, and then we have the approaches, and then under the approaches, we have the ideas for engagement. So you see under the strengthening coordinated community-based systems and building community awareness of services, you see the work with leaders. So the referral pathway, the access to response services, outreach and awareness raising, which a lot of GBV teams do. We had to unpack awareness raising, because awareness raising really stretches across all areas. So that could relate to risk mitigation, to social norms change, but it also can relate to just building awareness of response services. And then the maybe trickier piece of the attitudes, that we wanted to see what's possible beyond training with leaders. So also some guidance around how to hold group discussions with leaders, and that those kinds of discussions could center around different topics, depending on a lot of factors, I guess. But to talk in general about GBV or respect for survivors, to work through some issues through hypothetical cases. We also have some guidance on holding practice sessions with leaders, just the way, you know, that we would do with caseworkers, for example, to sort of really practice the skills of how we would respond to a survivor. What if a woman or a girl in your community comes to you and discloses something or seeks your help? How do you respond to that? And we link that very much to the pocket guide, the ISC GBV guidelines pocket guide for basic response and referral. And then some guidance around, you know, leaders can be very involved with helping helping women who are at risk, especially women who continue to live in situations of intimate partner violence. So how to provide emergency assistance to people who we know are facing problems, and the sort of the alerts that women might use to seek individual help. And then finally, the guidance around leaders' involvement with specific cases and specific survivors. So we have, for the tools linked to that for GBV teams, we have a planning guide and tool for thinking through, really planning as a team, how we would do advocacy with leaders on behalf of survivors when that's appropriate. And there are many factors for GBV programs to think through about when that would be appropriate. And this is only for GBV programs that have individual support services in place. They're supporting survivors. They know that survivors want this involvement of leaders. They want the GBV program to be speaking on their behalf. The GBV program feels comfortable doing this. And then some planning around it, what it would look like. And then linked to that are some fact sheets. So to be sure that we have some sort of facts and talking points at our disposal when we're engaging leaders and trying to address GBV in general, but also trying to find better ways forward for survivors. So I hope some of this makes sense. I can link quickly to the chapter and we can see what it looks like. So this is the response chapter. You see the sections outlined at the start. And then you can link directly to the tools here or go through those concepts. Again, the examples from practice, some of them, this one is pretty long, but I think it illustrates a lot of work that we do in terms of response with leaders. The approaches, and then here you'll see the ideas for engagement. And each idea for engagement is generally about 1 page long, so it's not, super dense, each section. And then they'll link to tools here. So you'll see the training is one way of engaging leaders, and then you'll link to the training manual. Group discussions, and then here you can link directly to group discussion guides. So I hope this makes some sense. We've tried to make it practical and user-friendly. I hope that you find that it is. The practice sessions I mentioned. So this is the emergency assistance and coded communication. And then we have a longer section on the direct advocacy with leaders in support of survivors. So unpacking what that might look like. We have the advocacy tool. This is the longest section, the survivor-centered support, justice, and mediation. So it gives guidance to teams on how they would understand those procedures, how they might support survivors who are engaged in those processes, how they might influence those processes. So there are different ways that they might be involved. So you'll see all of this sort of throughout. I think we have 5 different ways that the teams might be involved in those processes. So this is the longest area of engagement because it was from the beginning of this process something that teams really wanted more information on, and there is so much written about this. But what we found, to our disappointment, is that most everything that's written about this just speaks to the challenges and the problems. And I think wherever you're working, you're deeply familiar with the challenges. So we really struggled to not just present the problem, but to try to share with teams, these are the things you can do. And so that was our challenge. I'll link here the direct advocacy so you can see this is one of the tools. It's the planning guide with leaders. The link isn't working. Let me see if I scroll down. So we have the different links here. Let's see if this one works on mine. I think I'm not in the right setting for this. Tip sheet. So these are the tools. Now I'm in the planning guide. So if you're doing direct advocacy on behalf of survivors, this is the planning tool. And this is available. If you link directly to this tool from the website, you can access this tool in Word so that you can print it and manipulate it and populate yourself. But this gives some steps that a team would take to plan that engagement, and then some really simple ways to sort of think through the problem. What is the issue? Have we met our safety and ethical requirements? What exactly do we want the leader to do in this situation? And then thinking like from the leader's perspective as best we can, like how receptive are they going to be to this issue? What are they going to be concerned about? What are some key points that will best speak to the leader's interests and concerns that we want to highlight? What other things do we think are important to bring to the discussion? And then preparing for the challenges that might arise. And there are tip sheets specifically on those kinds of challenges as well. And then thinking, just preparing the way that we would for any important meeting, you know, keeping in mind the way that we want to communicate and things like that. So this is really like building up the skills and the really preparing ourselves for that kind of engagement. And then I mentioned the fact sheets here would also hopefully help us prepare. So that's the response. I'm going to take us through a few more chapters briefly and then leave some time for discussion. Each chapter, you'll see the same format repeating. So that's risk mitigation. Under the approaches, you see the ideas for engagement related to risk mitigation. This is an area where we felt, as IMC, I'm not sure if others would feel the same, that we really could do probably a lot more, that there's more creativity, ideas of what more we could do with leaders, that leaders can do themselves to make communities safer and to better prepare for episodes of displacement or emergency. So this was kind of fun to think through, like, what more could we do? And I mean, I can link quickly to show you, you'll start to see, of course, the same format in each. Here's the risk mitigation chapter, the tools up front, but then you'll go through the concepts, the approaches, and then under each of those, the areas of engagement, starting with safety audits. So safety audits might be something that a GBV program is doing, and then they can open this guide and say, you know, we've been doing safety audits. We've never thought to involve community leaders in our safety audits. So what could that look like? And we hope that programs will find different areas of their own work and then be able to hop straight to those. How might we involve community leaders? Would that look like something more meaningful or more successful with our program? Okay, so then we have transformative change. So this, we're looking at the longer term changes that we want to see. So really getting down to issues of unequal power as the root cause of GBV, and thinking about what it would take to build like a safer and more equitable future for all women and girls. In this, of course, it wouldn't be one-off work. And we do want to see programs that have very thoughtful approaches to what transformative change really looks like. And I mentioned that this toolkit is not establishing a new program in that way. This is meant to be sort of a menu of options. So within the approaches here, we want, the first approach is to use an established transformative change program. And in the guidance, we present an overview of a few of those, of 5, I think, select transformative change programs that have been used with community leaders in emergency settings to address GBV. So we look specifically at SASA and SASA Faith, SASA from Raising Voices, SASA Faith from Raising Voices in Trocare, EMAP, Engaging Men in Accountable Practice from IRC, and then Tipping Point from CARE, which is looking at child marriage, and also Communities Care from UNICEF, which is looking at sexual violence and conflict. So we provide kind of a 2-page overview of each of those programs, what resources are required, where you find the information, and if programs, hopefully that gives programs some simple way to kind of compare the programs, and then to dig deeper into each of those approaches to see what might be appropriate for their program and setting. If that's not the right way to go for a program, if the resources don't allow for them to adopt that program, then there might be other options. So one other option, which is also very resource and time intensive, is to create a new transformative change program. So we provide some basic guidance on what really is required to do that, which is, again, to emphasize, very resource intensive. And then the third approach would be to, the idea is there nothing else we can do? You know, if we're not implementing SASA or EMAP, if we don't have the resources to build a full transformative change program, maybe we only have a short period of time in this emergency, is there anything we can do to contribute to transformative change? So then we also provide some guidance on what programs can do that is more limited, but that is still working toward transformative change in a way that's responsible, and even if it's more one-off, that it wouldn't be harmful, that it's still contributing to something that may lay a foundation for more work in the future. And under that, we saw opportunities to still build awareness as sort of a first step to change, to fostering better attitudes and behaviors, and then also to promoting women and girls empowerment. So under each of those 3 approaches, that would be for the more limited engagement, we dive into some ideas for engagement. So we're not replicating the guidance, again, to emphasize that already exists. We're supplementing with what programs might look to when they're not implementing one of those full tested approaches. So these areas of engagement are there. They're linked again to the tools here. And I can show you briefly what this looks like, the chapter. I know it's getting repetitive. You see the same format each time, but I'll show you briefly. This is where we've outlined, you know, using an established program, the benefits of using an established program and not starting from scratch. And then we've outlined some comparative information of different programs. And this is, I should emphasize, that we did have this reviewed, of course, by the different organizations that have these branded approaches. So we hope that's useful just to have in one place. And then we talk about the challenges of creating a new program, but the challenges and opportunities, and then the additional ideas for engagement if you're doing something simpler, something that's not that one of those full approaches. Okay. Supporting women leaders then is the final chapter, and especially for anyone who may have joined later, I do want to emphasize that the entire toolkit is meant to relate to both men and women leaders, but that we have additional content related to providing additional support to women leaders. So this is looking at some of their unique needs and approaches that might be tailored more to working with women, but that the whole toolkit should be applied to all types of leaders. So the key approaches we identified here were related to supporting women who are already in leadership positions. So that might be related to elevating their roles or identifying with women leaders any skills or needs that they have that we can help to strengthen. It also involves, of course, funding or supporting organizations and women leaders where possible. And then we have an approach of supporting emerging leaders. So these would be people who we identify, or the community identifies, as having a lot of potential, having a lot of informal influence, maybe also adolescent girls who are demonstrating interest or potential in becoming leaders as adults. So some work to really strengthen that, and then also the enabling environment. So, so working with all of the others in the community to build a better environment for women's leadership. And some of the ideas for engagement you see outlined under each of those. And some of this, again, you know, because we did this through assessment and piloting and then a lot of consultations, this is led by feedback that we received from women's organizations and women leaders. I'll look briefly at this then, this chapter. We have the women leaders. And you'll see the examples from practice again throughout. And then finally, if we scroll all the way down, we'll have the tools. All right. So those are the guidance chapters. And then linked to the guidance, of course, is that other piece. And I'm not going to take as much time to go through the training manual as I did to look at the chapters of the guidance. But to clarify that the training manual is linked to the guidance, that you'll see a lot of repetition even in titles. The training manual is outlined first with an introduction and information on planning trainings, and then the training content itself. And the training content is divided into these sections that you see. They mostly mirror the chapters of the guidance, but not completely strictly so. So we have the GBV core concepts, and that is the only training that we identify as really fundamental across any audience. So for all of the additional trainings, we want to see that first we've started with some GBV core concepts. So this is a menu of options. We don't expect, that everyone would be training leaders, in the same leaders in everything. But even if you want to engage leaders in a GBV risk mitigation training, that first it's important to establish a foundation of some core concepts. So we have that first, and then we also have at the start of each other training agenda, we have a quick review, a recap of a couple of hours of the core concepts. And then for GBV teams, we have linked to the building a foundation, 2 chapters of foundations. One is key approaches, and the other is the planning for engagement. So that's working with teams through the 6 steps that are outlined in the guidance through a sort of training format. And then the response, risk mitigation, transformative change, and women's leadership. So I'm going to actually go forward and then back. Let's see. So this is just an outline of the training agendas. I thought it might be useful just to see how we've broken this up in terms of time. And then we also have the different audiences outlined for each of these. So for example, when it comes to key approaches, we have one agenda that we include all the sessions for GBV teams, that would be GBV programs. But then we also found a lot of those approaches would be useful for working with women leaders. So talking about approaches like some of the reflection exercises, some of the intersectional feminist approaches, to work with leaders on that as well. So some of those sessions are drawn out for women leaders, and in the notes you see that could be added to the 2-day training on women's leadership that is down at the bottom. So this is sort of, the idea is that you can play with the content and develop different agendas. So it could be like a 5-day training where you're combining some of these pieces, or it could be a simple 1 or 2-day training. And then with the GBV teams, some of this, like the planning for engagement, for example, with GBV teams, you could do that in a 2-day training, but the sessions are also divided in such a way that if it makes more sense to build across your work plan over the course of like a month, you could take an afternoon each Friday and organize the content that way instead. So it's meant to be flexible. All of the training content is also, there is no PowerPoint. So it's all developed for low resource settings, or that you could do with community leaders without any tools at your disposal aside from maybe some printed handouts, some flip chart paper and markers. But aside from that, it's very low resource. This is the format for each training section. You'll have at the top of each section, there is the who the training is for, how does it link to the toolkit guidance, that other piece, the manual we went through, the overall time and resources required, and then the training outline. So we have the summary of the modules involved in the training agenda, the time required for each, and then under each specific module in the agenda, there is the title, the summary, the objectives, and then what the facilitator needs to do to prepare, the procedure down to the handouts. I'm going to show you just as an example here, one of the training sections. So this is the section on women's leadership. So you'll see at the top who it's for, linking to the guidance, the resources required. And so here you have the different recommended agendas, the 2 days, 1 day. And then this note about low technology settings. So all that's required is the toolkit guidance, flip chart, individual notebook and pens, and some handouts. So this would then be printable and hopefully useful in a variety of settings. And then you get to the training outline at the top. So it shows the different modules within that 2-day outline, an overview of each, the estimated time for each, and then you get into the modules themselves. So each module is usually like a page or two, plus sometimes handouts, because the procedure for the facilitator is outlined in steps. So I'm showing these in English to remind everyone these are available in English, French, and Arabic.
And Micah, someone asked if the Spanish was in place.
We don't have Spanish in place yet, but if there is interest, I would love to hear from people about that interest, because we both are interested in feedback and sort of adapting things as a living resource, adding to this and making adjustments, but also potentially translating into additional languages. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint just to show you overall what the training manual looks like, because I dove right into one session. So this is from the start of the training manual. That I do think it's useful not to skip over the introduction and the sort of how to use the manual, because there's a lot of information here on planning the trainings, especially special considerations for planning trainings with leaders and thinking through, for example, how to set a respectful tone, what participatory learning looks like, and setting expectations with leaders. I think that this is really important to, even for people who are experienced trainers, whenever you're working with a new audience and you want to be sure that you're really tailoring the training in the right way, to maybe pause and reflect on some of that, because we don't necessarily want to take the same approach that we take with our own teams when we're working with adult leaders. And that could include thinking through some things like pre-post tests, whether that's, setting the right tone and rapport at the start of a training with leaders. So please don't skip over that. I think there's really some useful information there. And then we have that's just the overviews of the different audiences. So here again, you see those audiences. These are the general audiences for the whole toolkit, but it gives a rationale for why we would work with some of the different leaders together. There are opportunities. We hope to have trainings that would include GBV teams and leaders together, learning together, so that that the relationship between leaders and GBV teams should not be like directional in the sense that they only have to learn from us. That the approach of this toolkit is really to understand the complementarity of the roles of different actors in the environment, but definitely to respect the very important roles that community leaders play, and the knowledge and experience that they bring. So I think hopefully there are good opportunities in many settings for us to have some joint trainings as well. So just going through that, you see this is the overview of the agendas that I showed in the PowerPoint. And then more of the guidance. So I know it's difficult the way that I'm showing to get into it, but hopefully you'll dig around yourselves online and see more. But that's the training manual. And from the top of the resource too, I showed you, and I can go back to that if it's useful for people who may have joined at the end, the very the landing page of the whole resource. You can link to each piece of the toolkit individually, or the full resource. So let me go to that again. Now here we go. So this again is the landing page. This is where you find everything. So when you scroll down from the top, this is where you download the full resource in English, French, or Arabic, or you can go to an individual chapter of the guidance. Here on the right, there are the banks of tools. So if you link only to one of these tools, some of these tools are in Microsoft Word, so you can directly edit. Some are in PDF as well. And then down here we have the training manual. So just like with the guidance, the training manual is broken up as well into individual sections. So if you prefer only to download one of these training manuals, you don't have to download the full PDF. And hopefully that's also better for the environment than if you're printing.
So we've got about 20 minutes left, Micah. So,
yep. Oh, wow. Talked a long time.
Any last thing you want to add, or should we go to the questions?
I don't. No, I want to go to questions, please.
Okay, great. So the first question we got was asking a little bit more about the leader engagement. What factors enabled success with leader engagement? Was it related to the context, the openness of the leaders they were working with? Any other factors you can expand upon?
No, it's a broad question, right? I mean, the leader engagement in general. I mean, I guess I'll just share that we definitely found a range of experience across program teams. And I think one of the encouraging things that we saw is that even in really conservative settings, settings where GBV programs and community members had a lot of reservations about the ways that community leaders were addressing GBV, we still found in those settings real opportunities to work with leaders. That even if they have reservations about some of the work that we do, or they weren't on the same page when it came to understanding forms of violence as violence, let's say, or responding in all cases in a survivor-centered way. They were still fully on board with mitigating some risks, or making some services more accessible. So some of that work at the community level, which is still so significant and can really make meaningful changes in people's lives, that there were great opportunities there. And because of our reservations about some of the ways they might respond to cases, that in many times, like, we weren't taking full advantage of the potential of working with leaders in other ways. And then when we were working with leaders more in the pilot countries, as I mentioned in the far north of Cameroon, we started to then identify more leaders who were sympathetic and strong allies than we'd realized at first sort of glance or first assessment. And so one of the things in building a foundation, those steps we take through the sort of initial identifying leaders, the initial mapping, but then also digging deeper into, okay, now who among the leaders, we see this is the leadership at large. We need to start to match the work that we think we have potential to do with the right leaders in the context, because leaders have multiple roles, multiple sort of scope of authority. And so if it's the religious leaders who are overseeing like marriage in the community and this is about forced marriage, then obviously those are the leaders you need to connect with. And who among those leaders then show that, maybe demonstrate that maybe they have the most positive attitudes, so then to sort of hone in on the leaders who we think are going to be most appropriate for those interventions. And for that, we have outlined suggestions for creating a community leader profile. And each of our teams then develop like the values, the attitudes, or the skills that they want to see in leaders to engage in different areas of work. And for risk mitigation, that profile might look very different from involvement in the cases. So that's really the whole idea of the Building a Foundation chapter, and training is for teams themselves to unpack, what is leadership in this community? What do we know about it? What do we need to learn? How can we identify more of the leaders who are women, for example? And then how can we match what we think we can do with the right leaders? Hope that.
Yeah, and that leads to another comment, kind of question that came in a bit later, saying sometimes our work identifies community leaders and we try to work with them, and this makes them more powerful than before, perhaps unintentionally. We expand their space, bringing more value to their opinions, and these are often male leaders, which might not be the reality of that community before. So we need to find a way to balance this. So.
Yes, I agree. And that was one of our initial reflections. It's something that we try to weave through the content. It's not an easy thing. We definitely appreciate that, but it's one of the challenges, one of the sort of guiding questions that we wanted to provide teams with some resources to sort of navigate that overarching challenge. And part of the answer, we think, is that that we look at leadership more comprehensively, and that we're also, that we're not just working in a very pragmatic way with what exists and building on influence and power that already exists, but also challenging the power structures, and as much as we can, trying to elevate the other voices of people who would be influential, and that those are very often the women and adolescent girls.
There were a couple of other questions that came from three different people, but I wanted to kind of combine them a little bit. Some people were curious about, when you were talking about working on gender-based violence, were you looking also at different diversity around gender? Were you looking at violence against men and boys? And did you look at the specific experiences of LGBTQ people, and were they considered in the assessments while this toolkit was developed?
Yeah. So specifically in the assessment, no, that's to say that we didn't try to identify those populations and as specific audiences in the assessment, no. And in each of these settings, they're quite conservative settings where LGBT populations are largely hidden for good reason, with safety concerns. But in terms of working with our own teams and with other GBV actors, yes, that's part of the discussion and part of our approach of thinking about GBV from an intersectional feminist lens, that we understand GBV to be largely related to issues of gender discrimination that affect women and girls, But thinking about women and girls in all of their diversity would definitely include the intersections that we see with LGBTQI populations. So that's outlined under the core concepts and approaches. I will say that the toolkit is rooted in the idea of GBV as affecting women and girls in their diversity, but that it's very much focused on that power dynamic and the issues that women and girls face in communities because of gender discrimination, and how that's elevated in emergencies or escalate. What am I trying to say? It's heightened, it's worse in emergencies. So that's our problem statement that we're working with when we're talking about engaging community leaders. And throughout the toolkit, we do use feminine pronouns, for example, when we're talking about survivors. So of course, there's recognition that sexual violence would affect different populations, including men and boys. But when we're talking about the community structures and the power relationships, it's definitely thinking about that hierarchy of power that exists between men and women and boys and girls.
Thanks, Micah. A lot of enthusiastic requests for Latin America to be included in Spanish translation in the chat. There was another question there saying, you'd mentioned before that we can often focus on the challenges, but not so much the solutions. And someone was asking if in the toolkit, are there examples of the challenge and then how to tackle them specifically?
Yes, I'm glad you had that. I mean, it was a lot of, and I would say after the pilot version too, really trying to just cut, like anytime, it's very hard for us, and I say us because there were a lot of people who worked on this toolkit, but the number of times that we just sort of slashed just pages and chapters of digging deep into the challenges. It was kind of painful. We've reserved some of that information in like baseline report, assessment report, but we really wanted it to be practical. So where the challenges are highlighted, for the most part, it's in each chapter of the guidance. We have the key concepts. So when you have key concepts of GBV Response, it will go into ideas of the kind of common challenges across contexts related to how leaders might respond to GBV. But then we really do try to link that to the what then. And that comes out both in the ideas for engagement, which is not the reason why they're ideas for engagement, is because each of them is not going to be appropriate for all contexts, right? So through that, we're taking kind of illustrative examples from practice of what has worked in some settings or what might be tried across multiple settings. And then we also have those call out boxes of examples from practice. And in some cases, those would be examples of where something went wrong. But for the most part, it's drawing out positive examples where, a program manager or someone from a program shared, we did this and it worked really well. And with that example, we sort of get to this question of, the leaders marrying girls off to the perpetrators instead of writing a whole thesis on the subject. We try to point to what programs actually do in those cases.
All right, thank you, Micah. Everybody, last chance to get your questions in. I also wanted to mention that there was some gratitude that you didn't make it a PowerPoint heavy training, and that you acknowledged in low resource settings that not everyone has good electricity. So there was some thanks from that.
I think I do enough PowerPoint trainings myself, so.
Any other questions from people? And if I don't see one, then maybe we'll wrap up a little bit early. So again, I put some stuff in the chat. about, if you're not familiar with the GBV AOR, which is our global working group to work on gender-based violence and humanitarian emergencies. You can find more information on the website. We're the community of practice. We're a subsection of the GBV AOR. And if you are a GBV specialist, and it's only for GBV specialists, you're welcome to apply and join us. A lot of our events like this webinar are open to all, but we do also have member-only events. We're currently doing some capacity building and trainings on advocacy for GBV actors, and also understanding better about diverse sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics in GBV. So if you're a GBV specialist and would like to be included, you can write to us at gbvcop@gmail.com. And thank you again so much, Micah, for this very intelligent and very interesting webinar. I think we saw really high engagement through the whole webinar, which is unusual. So you kept everyone interested, and I think a lot of people want to download this toolkit and start looking at it for themselves. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Sarah, I just tried to link the
yeah, I put the link in the chat several times while you presented, so they can all get it.
Already done it.
We will send you copies of the recording and the PowerPoints, as well as the link to the toolkit to everyone who registered for this webinar. So you'll get that soon. So thanks again and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.